A single, percussive crack echoed through the morning mist, followed by a groan of tortured steel. The ancient stone arch of the old mill bridge, a monument to a time long past, shuddered. Below, a small figure in a tailored suit watched, a shadow of despair crossing his face. A second, louder detonation. A cloud of dust and debris erupted, swallowing the skyline. But it wasn't the sound of the collapse that was most deafening. It was the whisper on his lips. They just made a mistake. He turned his back on the ruin, his posture straightening, his eyes cold. A mistake they're about to pay for. The email landed with the gentle chime of a gavel striking wood, a sound that, in Judge Elias Vance's world, signified the commencement of a new proceeding. This one, however, was not about a motion to dismiss or a complex civil rights case. It was an anonymous tip, a single cryptic sentence. They're going to hit the bridge at dawn. Elias, a man whose life was a study in methodical order, read the words and felt a flicker of something he rarely experienced in the hallowed halls of justice: unease. He knew exactly which bridge it referred to. The Old Mill Bridge, a relic of the industrial age, a local landmark, and, more importantly, a federally protected historical site. It was his morning ritual to walk its cobblestone path, a small escape from the relentless demands of his circuit court. He had fought for its protection 2 decades ago, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of federal bureaucracy to secure its status. It was his small legacy, his one personal victory that had nothing to do with jurisprudence. He dismissed the email with a sigh. It was likely a hoax, a prank. Who in their right mind would demolish a protected national monument? The legal repercussions would be immediate and severe. A federal offense, multiple counts of willful destruction of government property, not to mention a slew of civil lawsuits. No sane developer, no municipal worker, no one. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his worn leather chair, a beacon of calm in his otherwise hectic life. He was scheduled to hear arguments on a complex interstate commerce case, and he needed to be focused. His phone buzzed. It was his wife, Eleanor. "Elias, are you watching the news?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "No, Ellie, I'm preparing for court." "What's wrong?" "The bridge. The Old Mill Bridge. They're demolishing it." The coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the polished hardwood floor. The dark stain spread like a grotesque ink blot, mirroring the shock that was now spreading through his own mind. He scrambled for the remote, his movements clumsy and uncharacteristic. The television screen flashed to a live feed. A massive crane, a brutal mechanical beast, tore at the stone arch. A plume of dust and rebar filled the screen. The air was thick with the sound of grinding metal and the screams of a horrified public. The reporter on screen was breathless, trying to make sense of the chaos. "We're still waiting for official confirmation, but sources are indicating this is part of the new Riverbend Urban Renewal Project." Riverbend Urban Renewal. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. He knew that project. It was a massive, ambitious development helmed by Marcus Thorne, a man who had built his empire on the twin pillars of audacity and an absolute disregard for regulations. Thorne had tried to get approval for his project in this very court a year ago, and Elias had denied him, citing the protected status of the bridge and the environmental impact of his plans. Thorne had appealed, and the case was still moving through the system, stalled in some procedural purgatory. Elias felt a cold rage he hadn't experienced since his early days as a prosecutor. The meticulous calm he had cultivated over a lifetime evaporated. This wasn't a mistake. It was an act of pure, unadulterated contempt. Contempt for the law. Contempt for the courts. Contempt for him. He canceled his court session with a terse phone call to his clerk, the surprise and concern in her voice a stark contrast to his own seething anger. He then drove to the scene, navigating the gridlock of gawkers and news vans with a heavy foot on the gas. He felt an intense need to see the destruction for himself, to stand in the shadow of the broken thing and feel the cold reality of it. When he arrived, a barricade had been set up, manned by local police who were trying to hold back a crowd of protesting citizens. The air was heavy with dust and the acrid smell of burnt metal. The bridge was gone. In its place was a gaping chasm, a scar on the landscape. The river below, once framed by the graceful arch, now flowed unimpeded and ugly. He walked to the police line, his face a mask of stone. A young officer, flustered by the chaos, tried to stop him. "Sir, you can't be here. This is an active demolition site." Elias pulled out his federal identification and held it up. The officer's eyes widened. "Judge Vance, sir. My apologies. We didn't know you were here." "I am now," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "What authority do these men have to be doing this?" The officer shuffled his feet, his gaze darting to the foreman of the demolition crew, a hulking man in a hard hat who was barking orders into a megaphone. "We got a permit, Your Honor, from the city. The mayor signed off on it himself." Elias's blood ran cold. The mayor, Harold Jenkins, a political puppet with close ties to Thorne. The city permit was meaningless, an empty gesture. A state permit might have been a gray area, but a federal designation trumped all. The bridge was under the jurisdiction of the National Register of Historic Places, an agency that answered to the federal government. To get a demolition permit, they would have had to get federal approval, which would have come across his desk, and he had signed no such thing. He walked over to the foreman. The man, oblivious, continued to shout orders. Elias cleared his throat. "Who gave you the order to proceed?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. The foreman turned, a sneer on his face. "Who the hell are you? This is a private site." Elias slowly pulled out his ID again. The man's sneer vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then outright fear. Judge Vance? What are you doing here?" "I'm asking a question," Elias said. "Who gave you the order to proceed?" the foreman stammered. My boss, Marcus Thorne." "And what about the federal protection order on this bridge?" We were told that was a formality," the foreman said, his voice now a pathetic squeak. "That it was all taken care of." Elias felt a new wave of anger, this time aimed not just at Thorne, but at the web of corruption that had allowed this to happen. They hadn't just ignored the law. They had lied about it, manipulated the system, and intimidated those who stood in their way. He needed to be careful. He was a federal judge. He couldn't be seen as using his position for personal vendettas. But the law had been violated, a federal crime committed in broad daylight, and he was the one who had sworn an oath to uphold it. He drove home, his mind a whirlwind of legal statutes, precedents, and the quiet, simmering rage that was now a part of him. He knew he couldn't sit on the bench and preside over this case. It would be a clear conflict of interest. He would have to recuse himself. But he also knew he couldn't stand by and let Thorne get away with this. He needed to find a way to act to bring this man to justice without compromising his position. Back in his study, he began to make calls. He contacted the head of the National Register of Historic Places, a man he had worked with for years. The man, a kind and gentle academic, was devastated. "It's a disgrace, Elias. We had no idea. No one contacted us. We never issued a permit." He then called the U.S. Attorney's Office, a formal request for an investigation into the matter. He was careful, formal, detached. He was a judge, merely pointing out a potential federal crime. The U.S. Attorney, a young, ambitious woman named Sarah Chen, listened carefully, a note of surprise in her voice. "We'll get right on it, Your Honor. This is unprecedented." Elias knew it was unprecedented. And he knew that Thorne, with his money and his political connections, would try to bury this. He needed more than an official investigation. He needed proof, hard, undeniable proof that would stand up in a court of law. He needed to find the smoking gun. He decided to go back to the source of the initial tip. It was a long shot, but he had a feeling. He opened his laptop, found the email, and saw that the sender's address was a burner account. But there was a small detail, a single tiny pixel of information that a lesser man would have missed. The email had been sent from an IP address that traced back to a public library a few blocks from Thorne's corporate headquarters. It was a meager thread, but it was a thread nonetheless. He began to pull. He called a private investigator, a former FBI agent he had worked with on a difficult bribery case years ago, a man who owed him a favor. His name was Jack Riley, a grizzled old-timer who had a nose for corruption. "Elias, it's been a while," Jack said, his voice a low growl over the phone. "What can I do for a federal judge?" Elias explained the situation, the demolition, the anonymous tip, the IP address. Jack listened without interruption. A demolition, permit signed by the mayor, a protected federal site, and a tip from a public library near the villain's headquarters. "Sounds like a classic," Jack said. "A classic case of a man with too much money and not enough brains." "I need you to find the person who sent that email, Jack. Discreetly. Don't get me involved. Just find out what they know." "Consider it done, Your Honor," Jack said. "And, Elias, my condolences about the bridge." Elias hung up the phone and lo. The temporary restraining order landed on Marcus Thorne's desk like a viper in a garden of roses. It was a formal, sterile document, but its implications were a venomous strike to the heart of his empire. The legal jargon, cease and desist, irreparable harm, federal jurisdiction, felt like a personal affront. Thorne, a man who had built his fortune on bending every rule into a profitable curve, read the words with a deepening scowl. He had planned for every contingency. Public outcry, angry city officials, even a well-placed bribe or two. But he had not planned for Judge Elias Vance, a federal judge acting personally, not as a presiding officer, but as a catalyst for a full-scale legal assault. This wasn't an inconvenience. It was a war. Thorne slammed the document down. His office, a minimalist palace of glass and polished concrete, seemed to hum with his fury. "He can't do this," Thorne snarled at his chief counsel, a nervous man named Arthur Finch, whose face had gone a sickly shade of white. "He recused himself from the case. This is an abuse of power, a personal vendetta." Finch, a man whose life was spent meticulously navigating legal loopholes, wrung his hands. "Technically, he's not presiding, sir. The order was issued by another judge in the circuit, at Vance's request, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has already opened a preliminary investigation. They're treating this as a federal crime." "A federal crime," Thorne laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "For taking down a derelict old bridge? We had a permit. The mayor signed it himself." "A city permit is irrelevant, Mr. Thorne," Finch said, his voice trembling slightly. "The bridge was on the National Register. Federal trumps local. It's a clear violation of the National Historic Preservation Act. A felony, to be exact." The laughter died in Thorne's throat. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city he was building. A city that now included a gaping, ugly hole where a bridge used to be. He had been so confident, so sure that he was untouchable. He had anticipated the political backlash, the public relations nightmare. But he hadn't anticipated the quiet, unrelenting fury of a man who saw the law not as a tool, but as a sacred trust. Across town, in his book-lined study, Elias Vance was on the phone with Jack Riley. "The IP address was a dead end, Elias. It's a public library terminal, logged in anonymously. The city wipes them clean every night. But I did get a look at the timestamp. It was sent at 3:17 a.m. Not exactly prime time for a library lurker. Elias leaned back in his chair, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. The restraining order was in effect, the work crews were gone, and the silence was a welcome change. So, someone who didn't want to be seen, using a public machine in the middle of the night? Exactly, Jack said. And I've got a hunch. I've been doing some digging into Thorne's Riverbend project. The permit application was a mess, full of false environmental impact statements and doctored surveys. The city planner who approved it, a guy named David Chen, pushed it through at a record pace. The whole thing stinks. David Chen? Elias's mind connected the dots. Sarah Chen, the U.S. attorney. Is he related to the U.S. attorney? Brother and sister. She's a straight shooter, but her brother, he's in deep with the mayor's office. And there's a rumor that he was having a very public, very loud fight with one of his junior engineers a few days before the demolition. A guy named Kevin Foster. The fight was about legal liabilities. A new thread. Elias felt a surge of energy. Kevin Foster. Can you find him, Jack? Already on it. But I gotta warn you, Elias. This isn't just about a bridge anymore. Thorne's lawyers are running a full-court press, trying to get the restraining order lifted. They're making a lot of noise about judicial overreach and personal animus. They're trying to discredit you. Elias was unmoved. They can try. The law is on my side. Is it, though? Jack's voice was sober. This is a chess game, Elias. Thorne's got pawns in City Hall and bishops in the media. You're a king who's just shown his hand. He's going to come after you. Personally. Elias hung up and stared at the framed portrait of his wife, Eleanor, on his desk. He thought about her worry, her quiet, unwavering support. He had told himself this was about the law, but Jack was right. It was personal now. Thorne was a predator, and Elias had just walked into his territory. The next day, the morning news was a firestorm. Thorne's PR firm had launched a full-scale media campaign, framing the demolition as a necessary step for progress, a noble sacrifice for the city's future. They painted Elias as an out-of-touch, elitist judge, a man who cared more about a pile of old rocks than he did about jobs and economic growth. They even released a statement from Mayor Jenkins, who, with all the conviction of a man reading a script, claimed that he had been misled about the bridge's protected status. Elias watched the broadcast with a detached calm, the lies washing over him like an unpleasant tide. But Eleanor, sitting beside him, was a wreck. "Elias, this is getting out of control," she said, her voice shaking. "They're turning you into a villain." "It's a deflection, Ellie," he said, taking her hand. "It's all they have. They can't argue the law, so they're attacking the man." But he knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't a court of law. It was the court of public opinion, a place where facts were often irrelevant, and the loudest voice won. Just then, his phone rang. It was Brenda, his clerk. "Your Honor, you need to see this," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "A package just arrived for you. It's from Thorne and Associates." "What is it?" Elias asked, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "It's a photograph, sir," she said. "A picture of a brand new bridge. A huge modern suspension bridge. It's photoshopped right into the chasm where the old mill bridge used to be. And on the bottom, a handwritten note from Marcus Thorne himself. It says, 'Progress waits for no one, Your Honor, not even you. You can try to stop us, but we'll always be one step ahead.'" Elias's heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated fury. The note was more than a taunt. It was a promise that Thorne would not stop, no matter what. He would lie, he would cheat, he would break the law, and he would do it all in plain sight. He had demolished the bridge, a protected monument, and now he was promising to build his monument to his own hubris on its ashes. And in that moment, As the reality of Thorne's arrogance and disdain for the law settled in, Elias knew that this was no longer about a bridge or a restraining order. It was about a line being drawn, a line between justice and a man who believed he was above it. And that line was about to be crossed, in a way neither of them could ever have predicted. The photograph of the impossible bridge sat on Judge Elias Vance's desk, a glossy, infuriating monument to hubris. The note, a scrawled promise from Marcus Thorne, was the final insult. Thorne wasn't just mocking him, he was daring him to fight, daring him to use the law and promising, with a casual arrogance that made Elias's blood run cold, that he would win. Elias felt the calm he had so carefully cultivated throughout his life begin to crack. This was no longer a matter of jurisprudence, it was a matter of principle, a personal affront, a challenge. He sat for a long time, the silence of his study amplifying the furious pounding of his own heart. He picked up the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of the imaginary steel cables and sleek concrete. It was a beautiful bridge, a marvel of modern engineering, but in his eyes, it was a grotesque parasite built on the carcass of something historic and beautiful. He crumpled the photo into a tight ball and threw it into the wastebasket. Then, he picked up the phone and dialed Jack Riley's number. "Jack, I need an update," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "On Kevin Foster?" Jack's voice was a low growl on the other end. "I found him. He's gone to ground. He's holed up in a cheap motel on the edge of town, paying in cash. Looks like he's running scared." "Scared of what?" "He won't talk to me. Threw me out of his room before I could even finish my first sentence." "He's terrified, Elias. The kind of terrified that says someone made him a very good offer to keep quiet and a very bad promise of what would happen if he didn't." Elias felt a surge of cold-blooded determination. "A motel on the edge of town, you say? Which one?" Jack rattled off the name and address. "Elias, what are you going to do? You can't go in there yourself. You're a federal judge." "I'm not a federal judge on the weekend, Jack. I'm a concerned citizen." "That's a bad idea, Elias. A very bad idea. Thorne knows you're coming for him. He's not going to make it easy. And if Foster is running scared, he's a pawn. In a bigger game. You could be walking into a trap." Elias ignored the warning. He thanked Jack and hung up. He knew Jack was right. This was a risk, a huge risk. But he also knew he couldn't sit back and wait for the official channels to work. Thorne was moving too fast. He was already winning the war of public opinion. Elias needed a win, a witness, a piece of evidence that would bring the whole house of cards crashing down. He told Eleanor he was going out for a walk, a lie that felt bitter on his tongue. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a worry she tried to hide. "Be careful, Elias. Please." He nodded, kissed her on the forehead, and left. He drove to the motel, the worn leather of his car's steering wheel a comfort against the turmoil in his mind. The motel was a relic of a bygone era, its neon sign flickering like a dying pulse. He found the room number Jack had given him, a dingy door with peeling paint. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. A voice, muffled and panicked, came from within. "Go away! I don't know anything!" "Kevin, my name is Elias Vance. I'm a federal judge. I need to talk to you." A tense silence followed. Then the door cracked open. A young man with haunted eyes and a sallow complexion peered out. It was Kevin Foster, the junior engineer. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "I told you I don't know anything," Kevin said, his voice trembling. "You know enough to be hiding here," Elias said, his voice low and calm. "You know that the old mill bridge was federally protected. You know that the demolition permit was a fraud. You know that David Chen pushed it through. And you know why." Kevin's eyes darted back and forth, a trapped animal looking for an escape. "I can't talk to you. They said they'd destroy me." My career, everything. They said I'd never work again. Who said that, Kevin? Marcus Thorne? His people? The mayor? Kevin's face crumpled. Tears welled up in his eyes. Please, I have a family, a baby on the way. I can't risk it. Elias stepped closer, his voice full of a sudden, searing empathy. I know what it's like to have a family, Kevin. I know what it's like to be scared. But right now, you're not just risking your career. You're risking everything. They're not going to stop. They'll just move on to the next guy they can intimidate, the next law they can break. You have a chance here, Kevin. A chance to do the right thing, to stand up for what's right. Kevin shook his head, a fresh wave of tears rolling down his cheeks. You don't understand. They're everywhere. They're watching me. They said if I talked, they would make sure my family lost everything. A sudden, sharp sound from the street made both men jump. A car door slammed. Elias looked out the window. A black sedan with tinted windows was parked across the street, a silhouette in the driver's seat. It was a bluff, but it was enough. Kevin slammed the door shut, locking it with a frantic click. Elias stood there for a moment, the silence, now heavy with the weight of Kevin's fear. He had a witness, but a terrified one. He had a lead, but a dead end. He had a man who knew the truth, but who was too scared to tell it. He drove away, his mind a cauldron of frustration and a growing sense of desperation. He had tried to get to the truth, and he had come up against a wall of fear. Thorne wasn't just a developer, he was a manipulator, a puppeteer, pulling strings that Elias couldn't even see. He had to find another way. He had to go after the man himself, not just the pawns. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a front-page story. The headline, in bold black letters, screamed, "Judge Vance under investigation for ethical violations." The article, a hatchet job clearly orchestrated by Thorne's PR team, accused Elias of using his judicial position to intimidate a city official and a private developer. It quoted an anonymous source, almost certainly the mayor's office, as saying that Elias's actions were a clear and shocking abuse of power, a personal vendetta masked as a legal crusade. Elias read the words in his study, the newspaper rustling like dry leaves in his trembling hands. The article suggested he had been seen at the Riverbend Motel, a location connected to a disgruntled former employee of the Riverbend project. They had him, they had watched him, they had anticipated his move and used it against him. He wasn't just a villain to the public now, he was a corrupt one. He was a judge, and he had been caught in a compromising position. The implications were catastrophic. He would be forced to recuse himself from any future proceedings related to the bridge. His reputation, a lifetime of integrity and respect, was in tatters. Just then, his phone rang. It was Brenda, his clerk. Her voice was thin, reedy with concern. "Your Honor, the Chief Justice just called. He wants to see you this afternoon, privately. He says it's urgent." Elias knew what that meant. The Chief Justice would tell him to step down, to take a leave of absence to save the court from the scandal. He had been outmaneuvered. Thorne hadn't just gone after the law. He had gone after Elias personally, professionally, and mercilessly. He looked out the window at the city he had sworn to protect, a city that was now turning against him. He was a man alone, standing on a crumbling precipice. He had played by the rules, and Thorne had simply changed them. He had used the law as his shield, and Thorne had used it as his weapon. He had tried to be a judge, and now he was a suspect. He was backed into a corner, his options running out. He had only one move left, and it was a move that would either expose Thorne once and for all or end Elias's career for good. He picked up the phone. "Jack," he said, his voice now devoid of any emotion, "I need you to dig into David Chen. All of his bank records, his financial history, everything. Don't stop until you find something. Anything." I'm no longer just looking for a witness. I'm looking for a smoking gun." The fight had been taken out of the courtroom and into the shadows. And as Elias hung up the phone, he knew that Thorne had just made his biggest mistake of all. He had made it personal. And he had just found out that Elias Vance was a man who, when cornered, was willing to do anything. The Chief Justice's chambers were a sanctuary of mahogany and hushed reverence, a place where the weight of the law was palpable. Today, however, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Judge Elias Vance sat opposite Chief Justice Thomas Sterling, a man whose silver hair and placid demeanor belied a will of iron. The newspaper article lay on the coffee table between them, a grim, physical testament to the scandal that had erupted. "Elias," the Chief Justice began, his voice a low, somber rumble, "I have known you for 30 years. I have watched you uphold the integrity of this court with an unwavering hand. You are a man of principle. But this is a different matter." He gestured to the newspaper. "The court cannot afford this kind of public spectacle. The perception of impropriety, a judge acting on a personal vendetta, is a wound to our credibility that will not heal easily." Elias felt the words like blows, each one a testament to his own miscalculation. He had underestimated Thorne, underestimated his willingness to fight dirty. "Thomas, I can explain. My actions were not a vendetta. I was investigating a federal crime. I was simply trying to find a witness to a clear violation of the law." "And in doing so," the Chief Justice said, his eyes holding Elias's, with a piercing intensity, "you have put yourself squarely in the middle of a conflict of interest. You have compromised your position. The media circus, the public accusations, it doesn't matter what the truth is, Elias. What matters is the perception. And the perception is that you are no longer an impartial arbiter of the law." A sick feeling settled in Elias's stomach. He knew where this was going. He had been a judge for so long the bench was a part of his identity. To be stripped of it, even temporarily, was a death of a kind. "I am formally requesting you take an immediate leave of absence," the Chief Justice said, his voice softening slightly, a gesture of reluctant mercy, "until this matter is resolved, and the court can conduct its own internal investigation. It is the only way to protect the integrity of the institution we have both served for so long." Elias nodded, the silent acceptance a bitter pill. His career, his life's work, was being put on hold, a casualty in a war that had barely begun. He stood, his movements stiff and unpracticed. "Understood, Thomas. Thank you for your candor." The Chief Justice did not stand. He simply watched Elias leave, a look of profound sadness on his face. As the door clicked shut, Elias felt a cold sense of isolation. He was no longer Judge Elias Vance. He was just Elias, and he was a man with a target on his back. He drove, home in a daze, the city passing by in a blur of neon and concrete. He was a ghost in his own life, a man who had been told to simply cease to exist. But the rage, the righteous fury that had been building inside him, was a tangible thing. It was a fire that could not be extinguished. His phone buzzed. It was Jack Riley. "Elias, I think I got something," Jack said, his voice crackling with a barely contained excitement. "You told me to dig into David Chen's finances. I went deep. Real deep. And I found it." Elias pulled his car over to the side of the road, his heart pounding. "Found what, Jack?" "A wire transfer, Elias. A big one. $200,000. It came from a shell corporation called Riverbend Solutions. The paper trail ends there, but a quick search reveals the CEO and sole shareholder is none other than Arthur Finch, Thorne's chief counsel. The wire was made 3 days before the mayor signed off on the demolition permit. It's a classic bribe, Elias. A smoking gun. A triumphant wave washed over Elias, a feeling of vindication that was both glorious and tragic. He had found the proof. He had the truth. But he was now a civilian, a man under investigation himself. He had no official capacity to act on this information. He was no longer a judge. He was a man with a secret. "You have to get this to Sarah Chen," Elias said, his voice urgent. "She's the U.S. attorney. She has the authority to issue a warrant to get a grand jury. She can bring the full weight of the law down on them." "I've already tried," Jack said, his voice deflating. "She won't talk to me. She's keeping a tight lid on the whole thing. She said she's recused herself from the investigation because of her brother. Said it was a conflict of interest." Elias felt a new wave of despair. Sarah Chen, the one person who could act, was standing down. She was protecting her brother. The web of corruption, of cronyism and self-preservation was thicker and more suffocating than he could have ever imagined. He went home, the triumphant feeling from a moment ago gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had to act. He had the proof. He couldn't let it rot in his pocket while Thorne walked away, free and triumphant. He had to go to Sarah Chen. He had to make her see the truth. That evening, he drove to her house, a quiet, stately home in a leafy suburb. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. Sarah, looking tired and worried, answered. She was wearing a casual sweatshirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the severe suits she wore to work. "Elias," she said, her eyes widening in surprise. "I heard about everything. I'm so sorry." "You shouldn't be," Elias said, stepping inside. "I'm here because I need your help. I have information about the bridge demolition. I have a smoking gun." He laid out the details, the wire transfer, the shell corporation, the direct link to Thorne's chief counsel. He watched her face, the way her expression shifted from professional courtesy to a horrified, sick realization. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the warring emotions of a sister protecting her brother and a U.S. attorney upholding the law. "Elias, I can't," she said, her voice a fractured whisper. "He's my brother. I can't send him to jail. He's not a bad person. He's in over his head. He was pressured." "Pressure is no excuse for a crime, Sarah," Elias said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Thorne is going to keep using him, and the next time it might not be a bribe. It might be something worse. You have to stop this now." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't understand. I can't do this to my family." Elias looked at her, a profound disappointment in his heart. He had hoped for a hero, for a woman who would put the law above all else, just as he had always tried to do. But she was a human being, flawed and compromised. And in that moment, he knew he had lost. The law had failed him. His final, desperate gambit had failed. He had the truth, but no one with the authority to use it. He stood up, defeated. He walked to the door, his head bowed. He was a man without a purpose, a judge without a court. He had lost his legacy, his reputation, and now his final chance at justice. Just as he was about to open the door, he heard her voice, a low, trembling sound from the other side of the room. "Wait, Elias, wait!" He turned. Sarah was standing. There, a small, fragile figure, her face streaked with tears. She had a file in her hand, a worn, yellowing folder. "I recused myself from the investigation. I did it because of David, but I didn't recuse myself from all of it. I've been doing my own research. I've been watching Thorne for a long time. I never had enough to go on. Until now." She walked to him, her gaze meeting his with a newfound steeliness. "You're not the only one who cares about the law, Elias, and you're not the only one who has a smoking gun. I've been looking into Thorne's shell corporations for years. I have a whole network of them. And what you found, that's the final piece of the puzzle. Now, I have everything I need." She held out the file. Elias took it, his hands trembling. He opened it and saw pages of meticulous detail, a web of fraudulent companies, offshore accounts, and illegal transactions. Thorne hadn't just bribed a city planner. He had been running an elaborate, decades-long criminal enterprise. Sarah looked at him, her eyes fierce and resolute. "You can't be the judge in this case, but you can be the reason it comes to court. You're no longer a judge on the bench. You're a witness, and a key one. Now let's go get him." The worn file in Elias Vance's hands felt heavier than any gavel he had ever held. It was the culmination of years of quiet, meticulous work, a secret crusade waged by Sarah Chen in the shadows. He looked at her, and in her tear-streaked face, he saw not a compromised U.S. attorney but a true advocate for justice, a woman willing to sacrifice her own family to uphold the law. This is incredible, Sarah," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is everything." She gave a small, weary smile. "It was a hunch, a long shot. I knew something was wrong with Thorne's empire, but I could never connect the dots. Your bridge—" "It wasn't the crime, Elias. It was the symptom. The arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable." They sat up late into the night, poring over the documents. The wire transfer Jack had found was the key that unlocked a sprawling network of shell companies, illegal land acquisitions, and systematic bribery. David Chen's bribe was not an isolated incident. It was one in a long, incriminating pattern. Elias was no longer a judge seeking justice for a personal affront. He was now a witness, a guide through the labyrinth of Thorne's corruption, his testimony the final nail in the coffin of a criminal enterprise. The following morning, the atmosphere in the federal courthouse was electric. The news of Elias Vance's leave of absence had ignited a firestorm, but the true purpose of the grand jury was still a closely guarded secret. Elias, no longer in his judicial robes, wore a simple, dark suit. He felt a profound sense of nakedness, a vulnerability he hadn't experienced in decades, but he also felt a steely resolve. This was a different kind of justice, a direct and personal kind. The grand jury room was somber, hushed. Elias sat in the witness chair, facing 12 citizens who held the power to indict. Sarah Chen, poised and formidable, stood before them. She began her questioning, her voice calm and authoritative. She walked Elias through the events, from the anonymous email to the public spectacle of the demolition. She showed them the photograph of the bridge, a before and after image that spoke more than words ever could. Then, she pulled out a manila folder. "And now, Mr. Vance, I would like to introduce a piece of evidence, a wire transfer for $200,000 from a shell corporation to the bank account of the city planner who approved the demolition permit. A transfer that occurred 3 days before the mayor, on Mr. Thorne's urging, signed off on the permit." A murmur went through the room. Elias watched, his heart pounding, as the evidence was passed from juror to juror. He had done his part. He had borne witness. Now, the weight of the law was in Sarah's hands. A week later, the grand jury returned a true bill, an indictment on multiple federal counts of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. The arrests were swift and public. Marcus Thorne and his chief counsel, Arthur Finch, were taken into custody from their corporate headquarters. The news was a seismic event, a reversal of fortune so dramatic it sent shockwaves through the city. Thorne, a man who had seemed untouchable, was now a defendant, his face a mask of shock and disbelief as he was led away in handcuffs. The media, which had so recently vilified Elias, now hailed Sarah Chen as a hero. The story of the demolished bridge had now become a tale of justice served. Months later, the dust settled, both literally and figuratively. Elias Vance stood on the riverbank, exactly where he had been that fateful morning. The air was no longer thick with the smell of debris. In its place was a peaceful quiet. The chasm in the river was still there, a scar on the landscape, but a small foundation had been laid for a new bridge, one that would be built with public funds and with the blessing of the city. not the corruption of a man's greed. Beside him stood Sarah Chen. She was still the U.S. attorney, but she carried a new kind of confidence, a quiet steeliness. "My brother. He's cooperating," she said, her voice soft. "He's going to testify. He'll get a lighter sentence, but he's going to jail. It was the only way." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the spot where the old bridge had stood. "He made the right choice, Sarah. You made the right choice." "And you," she said, turning to him, "the Chief Justice is asking you to come back. They need a judge. They need a symbol of integrity." Elias looked at her, then back at the river. The old bridge was gone. His legacy of preserving it had been destroyed. But in its place, a new kind of legacy had been born, a legacy of fighting for what was right, not just from the bench, but from the front lines. He had lost the bridge, but he had helped to restore something more valuable, the integrity of the law itself. A small smile touched his lips. "I think," he said, "I'd like to take a walk first." The final chapter was not about a bridge, but about the bedrock of justice. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built an empire on the ruins of others' dreams, had finally met a man whose foundation was stronger than any he could demolish. And as Elias Vance walked along the river, the chasm felt a little less empty, filled now with the promise of a justice that, once broken, had been remade, stronger than